Good evening, everybody. Clinical meeting in Zoom. First, we have Dr. Jiggy from Medicine 4 on the topic double trouble.
Good evening, everybody. So I'll be starting this clinical meeting with my presentation. I'm from Medicine 4. So the topic of my clinical meet is double trouble. So this is the history of a 49-year-old gentleman who presented to casualty with the following symptoms. He had unsteadiness of gait for the last 3 months and altered sensorium for 2 days. This imbalance of gait was insidious in onset and gradually progressive, and there was no other significant positive history. And because of this complaints, he had left his job as a helper in electricity board due to his unsteadiness of gait. Significantly, there was no history of any peripheral vertigo, no tinnitus, ear complaints, no diplopia, no motor symptoms, no sensory symptoms, no bowel and bladder involvement. So significantly, personal history-wise, he's a chronic ethanol user, which is a dependent pattern for the last 20 years. Last consumption was 3 months back when he started having these complaints. He's a non-smoker. Past history-wise, he's a known patient to have seizures for the last 5 years, documented outside as alcohol withdrawal seizures. And initially, he was given some benzodiazepines. Subsequently, in a government hospital, he was started on phenytoin 100-200 mg daily, which he's been on continuously for the last 5 years. And recently, 3 months back, he was added on fluoxetine 20 mg also in a local hospital. The reason for this was not very clear. There was no history of any depressive, anxiodepressive illness or any mood affective disorder. And the wife clearly denied any possibility of overdose or deliberate self-harm with respect to either of these drugs. So given this history, we go on to examination. He was a moderately built and moderately nourished gentleman who had stable vital signs. He had pallor, no icterus clubbing nodes and edema. He had gingival hyperplasia with normal looking dentition. There was no local, the teeth appeared normal. It didn't look like the hyperplasia was secondary to any dental caries or any dental problems. And CNS examination wise, he was in delirium. So he was not oriented to time, place and person. Cranial nerves are normal. Motor system was normal. Sensory, particularly posterior column was normal. Romberg's test was negative. His reflexes in the upper limb and the lower limb were bilaterally brisk. And he had pancerebellar involvement. He had gaze-evoked horizontal nystagmus bilaterally. Finger-nose test and heel-shin test were present bilaterally. Dysdiadochokinesa was more prominent on the left side than the right. And he was unable to do tandem walk. There were no signs of meningeal irritation and spine was normal. So basically, to summarize, this is a middle-aged gentleman who presented with axial and appendicular cerebellar disease, who is known to have ethanol dependence, and he's on chronic phenytoin for seizure disorder. Now, to look at the various differential diagnoses, first of all, what is the syndromic diagnosis? This gentleman presented with a subacute or chronic pancerebellar syndrome. Anatomically, if you have to localize, the disease would go to the median part of the cerebellum, that is the vermis and the flocculonodular lobe, for the axial symptoms, and lateral cerebellar hemispheres for the appendicular cerebellar symptoms that he has. So he's got basically a pancerebellar disease. E2 pathologically, if you go about it, then given the fact that this chronologically, this is a subacute to chronic presentation, the most common etiology that we considered in his context particularly was drug, toxins or nutritional. Drugs meaning, was it a chronic phenytoin overdose? Because there's a history of this offending drug being in the past. Similarly, was it a alcoholic cerebellar degeneration? Because there's a history of ethanol dependence. Or was it a nutritional, like a Wernicke's encephalopathy? Because he had all the classical triads of Wernicke's encephalopathy. He had ocular signs, he had confusion, he had ataxia. But the only thing that goes against Wernicke's is that this is not an acute presentation. This has been there over a period of across 3 months. Now, other less likely causes, simply because he does not have any thread in his history or examination to connect to the other etiologies, were degenerative like a spinocerebellar ataxia, paraneoplastic cerebellar degeneration, infections like CJD, multiple sclerosis or hypothyroidism. But he did not have any other corroborating similar findings or symptoms or signs with respect to these diseases. So now the various etiology, what we are working with is basically a symmetric and progressive cerebellar signs. So this table taken from Harrison is basically the conditions listed in that red box. is the area that we are working with, because this is a patient who's got symmetrical cerebellar signs, which is progressive, and chronologically it is subacute to chronic. So here, as we listed out previously, intoxication is one possibility, paraneoplastic, hypothyroidism, alcoholic, Lyme disease, but Lyme disease is not endemic to India. It is seen in American continents, or TBS dorsalis, phenytoin, and amidron. So this is similar to the list that we also considered previously. Now moving on to investigations, he had anemia, which is normocytic normochromic, and other cell lines were normal, and he was found to have folate deficiency. Folic acid was 3.4. There was no evidence of any iron deficiency. LFT was normal. We ruled out hypothyroidism. TSH was 1.2. Now, serum phenytoin actually solved the problem for us because it was more than 40 mg per liter. And ECG, initially at presentation, QT was normal. There was no bradyarrhythmia, no tachyarrhythmia. However, at 10 hours post-admission, QTC had prolonged to 512 milliseconds. Imaging, CNS imaging, of course, was not warranted because by this time we have a diagnosis. So now I'll be looking at certain aspects of chronic phenytoin toxicity alone, basically focusing on the unique toxicokinetics pertaining to phenytoin, drugs that increase the levels of phenytoin, similar case reports worldwide whichever have been reported, and what management we can do. So basically, just a brief toxidrome of phenytoin toxicity. Phenytoin toxicity we can approach in two ways, either looking at which organ systems it involves, or looking at the clinical features with respect to which are dose related, which are not dose related. So organ system wise, basically organ systems are mainly involved: CNS, cardiac, and skin and soft tissue. So in CNS, the ones that are marked in red are the things that we had in our own patient. So basically our patient had nystagmus, he had truncal ataxia, he had slurred speech, he came in delirium. Phenytoin paradoxically can cause seizures, which can eventually cause coma, and they can have vomiting and lethargy. These CNS symptoms are largely seen with oral toxicity, whereas cardiotoxicity is generally seen with IV toxicity, and particularly when there is a rapid administration of phenytoin, which is why phenytoin should be administered when you're loading the patient. It should be given over a period of 30 minutes to 1 hour. So cardiac can be hypotension, bradycardia, ventricular dysrhythmias, and asystole. Skin-wise, they can have purple glove syndrome, DRESS, and SJS. Now, if you look at it dose-dependent, non-dose dependent wise, our patient had gum hyperplasia. He had folate deficiency, folate of 3.4. Other things are listed there. Similarly, if you look at the dose-dependent wise, then all the cardiac and CNS effects are actually largely dose-dependent. So our patient had a level which is more than 40, and he actually had all the symptoms which is seen in less than 40 and around 40. So he had nystagmus, ataxia, confusion. So looking at the pharmacokinetics of phenytoin toxicity, basically it has significant drug interaction. It is highly bound to albumin, and it particularly follows zero order kinetics. Then this particular unique fact of pharmacokinetic parameter of phenytoin makes it more toxic compared to other drugs which follow first order kinetics. So basically the zero order kinetics predisposes the plasma half-life to prolong itself beyond 24 hours, and which can actually extend to 24 to 230 hours. This is basically just an example of a zero order pharmacokinetics compared to a first order pharmacokinetics. So basically zero order, if you look at the first column, if we in zero order, basically what happens is that the rate of elimination will always be the same amount of drug. It will not be the same fraction. That means that whatever the plasma concentration may be, it will always be a same milligram of the drug which will get eliminated from the blood. So whether it is a high plasma concentration to start with or a low plasma concentration to start with, but the amount of drug that will get eliminated per unit time will always be constant. So for example, if we start the first column where we are having a plasma concentration of 200, and let us say only 50 mg gets eliminated every hour. So every hour, it will be only 50, 50, 50, which is getting deleted. So if the plasma concentration is 200, ultimately it will take 4 hours for the plasma concentration to become 0. And the T half from 200 to 100 will be 2 hours. Now let us look at the second column for the zero order kinetics. If I increase the plasma concentration to 300, in this case, for a drug which is having zero order kinetics, the drug that's eliminated per hour still remains the same because it is the same amount and not the fraction of the previous plasma concentration. So that means it will take much longer for the body to eliminate this drug at a higher plasma concentration. Subsequently, the T half in this case, for 300 to become 150, it will take 3 hours. So you see here that in zero order pharmacokinetics, the T half is directly proportional to the plasma concentration. Higher the plasma concentration, the T half will get prolonged even more. And it will take much longer for the body to eliminate, simply because it is eliminating only a particular amount of drug from the plasma. But in first order kinetics, we are having a particular fraction which is getting eliminated, and that fraction is based upon the previous plasma concentration. So if you look at the third column, the third box that we have, if you start with 200, ultimately it's the same fraction, and the T half always remains the same. It will be 1 hour. Whether it is we are starting from 200 to 100, or we're starting from 300 to 150, plasma half-life remains constant for a first order kinetics. This means ultimately what? That if you have a drug which is zero order kinetics, and even a small amount of increase in the plasma concentration can lead to very prolonged half-life and very slow rate of elimination. So basically, this is what it says. The first graph basically shows that in a zero order kinetics, if that's a water tank that you think of, every hour actually it will always be 2.5 units of drug which will get eliminated. It'll never increase. Even if you increase the plasma concentration, the body cannot. The liver is saturable. The amount of metabolic enzymes in the liver, basically the cytochrome P450 is limited for these drugs. So however much we increase the plasma concentration, our elimination will always remain constant. Whereas in first order, it will always be a fraction of the previous plasma concentration. There are other drugs which causes, particularly to remember, if you can remember a mnemonic, 0 watt power. So basically other drugs which follow similar kinetics is warfarin, alcohol, aspirin, theophylline, tolbutamide, and phenytoin. So these are the drugs that you have to watch out for with respect to the fact that they can have prolonged clearance. Okay, now the drugs that increase phenytoin levels in the body. So if you look at the second box of it below, fluoxetine figures as one of the drugs which can increase the phenytoin levels in the blood. And this is what a patient has been taking for the last 3 months, since which he has become symptomatic. He has started manifesting features of phenytoin toxicity. So now I'm just looking at fluoxetine-induced phenytoin toxicity. There are basically 3 case reports that I could come across. Basically a case report of a 62-year-old patient who was similar to our patient, who presented with progressive reduction in her sensorium. And she had been recently started for fluoxetine 20 mg daily, and for only 11 days prior to her presentation. And she had been, for epilepsy, she had been on phenytoin 300 mg daily for 30 years. The first report of a similar interaction between phenytoin and fluoxetine was reported in 1992 and subsequently in 97, where it was found that the mechanism is basically inhibition of cytochrome C2C9 metabolism of phenytoin. So in all likelihood, our patient also started having toxic levels of phenytoin after being commenced upon on fluoxetine, as he had been on an appropriate dose of phenytoin all along, and there was no history of any drug overdose. So this is simply a drug interaction which elevated the levels of phenytoin in his blood, causing him to be symptomatic for phenytoin, for which he's never been on a higher dose, or there was no history of any overdose or deliberate self-harm. So how did we manage this patient? Basically, management is conservative. And we were actually repeatedly assessing his neurological function by his GCS and seeing that if he will ever require any ventilatory support or whether he'll have a drop in GCS. And we were doing cardiac monitoring with repeat ECGs. Both the offending drugs were stopped, and his anti-epileptic was changed to levetiracetam. And later on, because there were financial constraints, the levetiracetam was later changed to valproate. He was given low-dose lorazepam for the delirium that he had for the initial 2 to 3 days. And the drug of choice for paradoxical seizures that happens in this setting is benzodiazepines. He was corrected for his folate deficiency, and thiamine was also given. And ataxia had resolved in a period of 5 days, and he was discharged at the end of 5 days with significant recovery of his cerebellar symptoms with a plan on OPD review. So the take-home messages will be that phenytoin follows a saturable, zero or non-linear kinetics, and at toxic doses, it can have significant elevation of its plasma levels in the blood, which contributes particularly and uniquely to toxicity with respect to phenytoin. And SSRIs, particularly fluoxetine, which has a significantly higher long T half, which is 9 days, should not be combined with phenytoin. And toxidrome wise, oral toxicity usually can present with a pancerebellar syndrome, as did with our patients, with my patient, and whereas IV use generally predisposes to cardiotoxicity. And management is conservative with an overall low mortality. Mortality reported in cases in USA is around 20% and is considered to be generally low mortality. Patients generally recover in a period of 4 to 5 days with conservative management alone.
Very well presented. Anyone has any doubts? We shall move to the next presentation, The Distorted Channel by Dr. Maria from Medicine 5.
Good evening. I'll be presenting on behalf of Medicine 5. Topic is distorted channel. This is a 31-year-old lady. She was recently diagnosed with diabetes mellitus. Now she presented with complaints of left-sided loin pain and fullness since 6 months, intermittent fever since 4 months, and vomiting since 1 month. She was apparently normal 6 months ago, till 6 months ago, when she developed left-sided loin pain, which is mild, dull-aching type of pain with no aggravating or relieving factors. She had low-grade intermittent type of fever associated with evening rise of temperature. No localizing symptoms with significant loss of weight and loss of appetite was there. Coming to her past history, she was recently diagnosed with diabetes mellitus and on oral anti-diabetic medications. She was non-compliant with her medication, and she also had history of recurrent urinary tract infection for the past 6 months. No history of any contact with tuberculous patients. Coming to her personal history, she was lost sleep and appetite, everything was normal, and she had a normal menstrual history, and she had 2 children, and her last childbirth was 8 years back. Coming to the examination, she was conscious oriented and her vitals were all stable, and general examination was within normal limits except for a mild pallor. Per abdomen, it was soft, non-tender, with no visible pulsations of peristalsis, but she had a 10 into 15 centimeter firm ovoid mass with irregular surface felt in the left lumbar region. The upper and the lower borders were palpable. The mass was not crossing the midline. It was bimanually palpable with minimal movement with respiration, and it was kind of ballotable mass. And the mass doesn't falls forward in a knee elbow position. There is no hepatosplenomegaly, no free fluids, and bowel sounds were present. She also had minimal left renal angle tenderness. Rest of the systemic examination was within normal limits. Based on this clinical presentation, the differentials that we considered are she was a 31-year-old lady, diabetic lady, with long-standing left flank pain, low-grade fever with evening rise of temperature, and loss of weight and loss of appetite, with a probable left-sided probable renal mass with left mild renal angle tenderness. So based on this clinical picture, the differentials that we considered were chronic pyelonephritis or hydroureteronephrosis, or in case of genitourinary tuberculosis, renal abscess, or a polycystic kidney disease with an infected cyst, or malignant renal malignancies like renal cell carcinoma, retroperitoneal fibromatosis, or IgG4 disease, and less likely an ovarian cyst or an ovarian malignancy, or a subserosal uterine fibroid. The initial preliminary investigations was within normal limit except for ESR and CRP was elevated, and urine routine showed pyuria. And based on the history of fever with evening rise of temperature, evening rise of temperature and significant loss of weight and loss of appetite, we have sent 3 early mornings urine samples for AFB, and all of them were negative. Her urine culture had shown E. coli and blood culture was sterile. And to rule out renal malignancy, urine cytology was sent for malignant cells, and that was also negative. So with this, we went ahead with imaging. This is the imaging that showed the CT abdomen that showed a Bierpo sign. That is basically what you see is an enlarged left renal kidney, and what you can see is a staghorn calculi. And you can see that the entire renal parenchyma is distorted with a heterogeneous opacities filling the renal parenchyma. This enlarged left kidney with a partial staghorn calculus in the renal pelvis and dilated calculi with thinned out renal parenchyma and diffuse perinephric fat stranding with thickened renal fascia. There was no evidence of any perinephric or psoas collection. All this typical CT finding is suggestive of xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis. So coming to a short definition on xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis, it is an unusual variant of chronic pyelonephritis. It was first described by Schwanpour in 1916, and the name was introduced by Oberling in 1935. Basically, this is a chronic inflammatory disorder of the kidney, and it is characterized by a destructive mass that invades the renal parenchyma, which is associated with an indolent bacterial infection. And the disease processes, it is due to the infectious phlegm, which begins in the renal pelvis and extends into the medulla and the cortex, which are gradually destroyed and replaced by lipid-laden macrophages, that is known as xanthome cells. It usually occurs in almost 1% of all renal infections, and this mostly occurs in settings of obstruction due to infected renal stones, and can be seen essentially in all age groups, but most frequently it presents in middle age group and in elderly patients. Studies in 1970 has found that xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis is seen in almost 8.2% of kidneys surgically removed or biopsied for chronic pyelonephritis. It is seen in almost 2:1 female predilection. This is because of an increased incidence of urinary tract infections in females and thus struvite or staph formation in females. There is also an increased incidence in patients with diabetes mellitus. This causes massive destruction of the kidney due to granulomatous tissue containing lipid-laden macrophages. Usually, the urine examination will show significant pyuria and bacteriuria will be there. And the most common organisms are E. coli, Proteus mirabilis, Pseudomonas, Enterococcus faecalis, and Klebsiella. And in certain, almost 24% of cases, urine culture can be sterile. So patients with prolonged course of chronic inflammation, there are reports where secondary amyloidosis can occur in these cases, leading to nephrotic syndrome. Despite often absent urinary tract symptoms, pyuria and positive urinary cultures can be seen in majority of the cases, like 95 to 60%. Most cases of xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis are diffuse involvement. However, up to 20% of the cases, it can be focal, and it can be like equal incidence can be there in both the sides. About 34% of the affected individuals will have a Staghorn calculi. And the most reliable and accurate modality for investigation, radiological investigation, is a CT abdomen that can characterize extrarenal involvement. Coming to the staging, based on the degree of the involvement of the adjacent tissues, there are 3 stages. In stage 1, the disease will be confined to the renal parenchyma only. And stage 2, it involves the renal parenchyma as well as there will be extension to the perirenal fat. And stage 3, the disease extends into the perirenal and the pararenal space, or there will be diffuse retroperitoneal involvement. Usually the diagnostic features are history of recurrent urinary tract infection with a palpable renal mass, and the CT findings will be in almost 75 to 80% of the cases, there will be a renal calculi with increase in the renal volume, almost 55 to 60%, and hydronephrosis will be there in almost 80%, and you can have the definite hypodense area with density of 15 to 25 HU with focal areas of parenchymal destruction filled with pus or debris and a ring enhancement of these low density areas. And extrarenal involvement can be seen in 15 to 20%, where it accounts to stage 3. Coming to the treatment, usually you give an initial course of antibiotics to control the local infection, and the definitive treatment is surgical, where you can go into different modalities. The usual ones are en bloc nephrectomy, where all the whole involved tissue is removed and any fistulas are closed. If possible, a radical nephrectomy, including the Gerota's fascia, should be performed. Patients with localized firm or bilateral disease, we can go ahead with a partial nephrectomy. And laparoscopic nephrectomy, depending on the extent of the lesion and the expertise of the urologist. In case of focal xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis, if the lesion is well localized, nephron sparing surgeries can be tried. Coming to our patient, what we have done was we have given her 14 days course of IV antibiotics followed by oral antibiotics, and she's been planned for an elective open nephrectomy after 14 weeks. And we are planning for a biopsy of the left nephrectomy specimen, both histopathology and expert of the biopsy to decide on the etiology.
What is the sensitivity of the E. coli?
It is shown. Urine culture was shown. We gave piperacillin tazobactam. It was pan-sensitive piperacillin tazobactam.
Any doubts? Yes. You can also type your questions in the chat box. If there are no doubts, we'll move to the next presentation by Dr. Lisi, the winner from Medicine 3. question is, what are the learning points?
Learning points is like in cases where they have a history of recurrent history of recurrent urinary tract infections with a palpable renal mass. You have to look for it is less common, but more you have to. The most important is you have to rule out malignancies, and also you have to look for possibility of xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis, because the definitive treatment for this has to be surgery, has to be done.
How was the sugars?
It was uncontrolled because she was recently diagnosed with diabetes mellitus, but she was not compliant with medications.
You can see this.
It was high. It was almost 9.7.
What are the histopathological findings?
Histopathological findings. It's mainly massive destruction of the kidney with the granulomatous tissue containing lipid-laden macrophages.
How did the name xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis, how did that name come? So where did it get its name? Why does it present subacutely?
Because of recurrent infections, the infectious phlegm will be initially it begins in the renal pelvis and then it extends into the medulla and the cortex, and it gradually destroys the renal parenchyma due to the lipid-laden macrophages. Therefore, this procedure takes it evolves due to recurrent infections. It evolves over a period of time.
The name also came from the
lipid-laden macrophages.
That particular color.
And that are known as xanthoma cells.
Why lipid-laden macrophages come?
I think the macrophages are the engulfing. I'm not exactly sure. I'll just look up and find.
Any other doubts, anyone? Yeah, meeting was not done.
So the first case, CNS imaging was not done, sir.
So, we'll go to the next presentation by Dr. Nissi Doverland from Medicine Tree.
Good evening. I'll be presenting on behalf of Medicine Tree today. So this is about 25-year-old primary gravid at 18 weeks of gestation who had come from Katpadi with a history of fever for 2 weeks, vomiting for 2 weeks, and blanching erythematous generalized rash for about 1 week over the abdomen and over the chest. She also gave history of dark-colored urine for the past 1 week. Otherwise, there was no other comorbidities. Past history-wise, there was a history of being treated for dengue back in 2019. With examination showing the patient was conscious, but then she was lethargic and dehydrated at presentation with a pulse rate of 120, BP of 110/60, and a respiratory rate of 18 per minute. She was febrile at presentation. At presentation, although historically there was a history of rash, there was no rash at presentation. Systemic examination wise was normal. So, as in any other case, the common differentials that we considered in this patient were dengue, scrub typhus, leptospira, malaria, which was considered less likely as the patient was not coming from a high prevalence area. Other differential, because of the prolonged history of fever, enteric fever with raw spots was considered a likely possibility. So we went ahead, investigated the patient. CBC showed an HP of 10.4 with a counts of 5,000 with a platelet of 40,000. Renal functions were normal. Electrolytes were sodium was 135 with a potassium of 3.9 with a bicarb of 17, showing signs of acidosis. LFT showed a total bilirubin of 3.5 with the direct bilirubin of 2.6. With the total protein 5.8, albumin of 2.6. There was no transaminitis and ALP was 96. So a smear was done. To our surprise, it came positive for malarial parasite, and she was positive for Plasmodium vivax with gametocytes, trophozoites, and schizones seen in the smear. Blood cultures were negative. So basically, this is about a lady who had presented with prolonged fever, in which surprisingly a diagnosis of malaria was made based on the blood picture. So why we are discussing this case and why malaria is a big problem in pregnancy is what we're trying to achieve through this presentation. So if you look at the global picture, globally, malaria burden has definitely declined over in the recent years. If you look at it, over 40% of the world's population still remains at the risk of infection, and over 4 lakhs people die every year. In India, more than 90% of the population live in malaria transmission areas, with more than 2/3 of the infection is caused by Plasmodium falciparum and 1/3 by Plasmodium vivax. And Plasmodium falciparum, as we know, it can lead to complicated malaria. We'll come to what is complicated and uncomplicated malaria later on. Out of these, the number of cases reported of malaria cases reported in India, about 30 million cases are tested positive, out of which at least 24,000 deaths are reported every year, which is not a small number, even in this era with so much of medical advancement. So why is pregnancy? Why are we discussing about malaria and pregnancy? And why the reason being, pregnancy is a vulnerable state to malarial infection, and the reason being attributed to immunological changes which occur in pregnancy leads to a semi-immune kind of status. They're not completely immunocompromised, but definitely the immunity is less during pregnancy. And there is another important thing to notice is there is a unique predilection for a subset of Plasmodium falciparum parasites to sequester in the placenta. Again, that happens in Plasmodium falciparum, but placental sequestration is not a major feature of Plasmodium vivax infection. So what are the consequences? Why is malaria a big danger in pregnancy? So we're dealing with 2 lives here. One is the maternal as well as the fetal. So maternal complication can start from ranging from anemia, acute lung injury, which is acute pulmonary edema, severe hypoglycemia, coma, death. Mortality can be higher in malaria. Fetal complication, it can result, if not treated and if not caught on time, it can result in miscarriage, stillbirth, premature delivery, and fetal growth restriction. So, so this is one of the articles from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. The thing is, why is malaria difficult to diagnose? In pregnancy, they may not have a specific symptom or sign when they present, and they can even present, malarial infection can present with a flu-like illness. They may not really have a history of travel to a malaria endemic area. Without high index of suspicion, they can even miss out on the diagnosis. So what are the symptoms and signs of malaria that they can present with? The symptoms, it can range from fever with chills, with chills, without chills, with sweating, headache, and other non-specific symptoms that we can see in any other flu-like illnesses, like headache, muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cough, general malaise. The signs, they can present with jaundice. They'll be febrile, perspiration, pallor, splenomegaly plus minus sometimes. And it might be difficult to pick up splenomegaly because if they have a gravid uterus. Like they can present with, in severe state, they can present with respiratory distress. Again, difficult to pick up in pregnancy sometimes because of the gravid uterus, the respiratory rate is generally high. So before we go into the treatment of malaria, we'll just quickly look at the Plasmodium life cycle. As we know, there are 5 different species. So Plasmodium, how is it transmitted? What are the 2 different cycles? So the mosquito vector transmits the Plasmodium species into in the sporozoid stage. So when it enters a human body, that is in sporozoid stage. That happens during the blood meal. So within about half an hour to 1 hour, the sporozoids goes to the liver cell where they divide and they form merozoites. So the sporozoids becomes merozoites. The infected liver cell ruptures and it releases the merozoites into the bloodstream, where they invade the RBCs and begin the asexual reproductive stage. What we need to understand, the asexual reproductive stage happens in human beings and the sexual reproductive stage happens in the mosquitoes. So once the merozoites are released into the bloodstream, they enter the RBCs and the asexual reproductive stage starts. And the symptoms develop 4 to 8 days after the initial RBC invasion. The replication, the division cycle of the merozoites within the RBCs lasts for about 36 to 72 hours. That is from RBC invasion to once the RBCs are invaded and once the cell is full, then they get hemolyzed. Thus, in infections that originate from a single infectious bite, the fever occurs every 36 to 72 hours. That's what we call, based on the species, we call potent malaria, tertian malaria. Once they're released, once the merozoites are released, they're released in a mass and results in high-grade fever with chills. Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale can also have a property of entering into dormant state in the liver, and that's called hypnozoites. We've already dealt with two different terminologies here: sporozoites, and the third terminology is hypnozoites. I've just otherwise called the dormant state. So what happens to the merozoites that is relieved from the RBCs? So that has got two options basically. So that can either invade further other RBCs and continue to replicate and causes symptoms. Otherwise, they can differentiate into male or female gametocytes. So these gametocytes, once the gametocytes are formed, the nature takes turns. The gametocyte tends to concentrate in skin capillaries, where it's easier for the mosquitoes to come and bite us and cause disease. So in the gut of the mosquito, once the gametocytes enters the mosquito, it goes to the gut, and each male gametocyte produces 8 microgametes after 3 rounds of mitosis, 3 rounds of division. The female gametocytes matures into macrogamete, and the male microgametes after 3 rounds of mitosis, they are the unique thing about the male microgametes. They are motile forms with the flagella, and they chase the female macrogamete. The male and the female gametocytes fuse and they form diploid zygote. The zygote elongates and forms into a particular form called ookinete. This is also motile, that has a property to cross the lumen of the gut, and they form into a stage called oocyst. This oocyst again undergoes cycles of replication and forms the sporozoites, which was the first stage that we talked about. And this is what because it's motile, it goes into the salivary gland. And once the mosquito bites a human being, then the sporozoites goes into the human blood, and the cycle continues. This is what we've described in this picture. The left side is the human host side, and the right side is the mosquito vector side. So, like if you look at it, the sporozoites getting into the hepatic cycle. Then the below that is the RBC cycle, and then the gametocytes being formed. It is goes to the right. Mosquito takes inside, and the sexual cycle continues in mosquito. And finally, the sporozoites form, and the cycle continues. So there are 3 strategies for drug action based on the cycle. So if you look at it, one is the prevention. First one is the prevention. Drugs that prevent Plasmodium species invading or proliferating in the liver. That is called prophylactic activity. Second is drugs that block the RBC stage. So that helps in the symptomatic phase of the disease. Then there are other compounds that inhibit the formation of gametocytes or the development in the mosquitoes. These include the drugs that kill mosquitoes feeding on blood, and these are otherwise called transmission blocking agents. So this is the pictorial representation. So first one is the falciparum, the stage of ring stage, trophozoite and schizones. So if you go back into this picture, if you look at the RBC stage, so the merozoites, they form the ring stage, followed by trophocyte, followed by schizones, and then the cycle continues. Then is what actually the gametocytes form. So those the RBC stages, or 3 stages in the RBC, is what is represented in this picture. So one unique thing about vivax is in the trophozoite stage, they look like the trophozoites are amoeboid in shape. That's how you differentiate. So like we talked about, before we treat malaria, so malaria basically, it can be complicated, otherwise called severe malaria, or it can be uncomplicated. So what are what is the importance in picking up severe malaria? And so because the treatment differs on that actually. So what are the diagnostic criteria for severe malaria? So there are clinical criteria as well as laboratory criteria that we look at. Clinical criteria, if you see that the patient is lethargic, dehydrated, has features of prostration, or if the patient has features of confusion or agitation, with the GCS more than 11. But if you notice that the patient is confused or agitated, that is again a clinical it's a feature of severe malaria, which is very important to pick up. If the GCS goes less than 11, yes, we know that the patient is clinically having severe malaria. Otherwise, if you look at the vitals, if there is features of respiratory distress, which can be secondary to acidotic breathing, if the patient has had features of seizures, and if the blood pressure is the systolic blood pressure in an adult, I'm talking about less than 80. Sometimes the blood pressure might be well above 80. But then how to pick up impending shock will be to look at the capillary refill time. If it is more than 2 seconds, that is showing that is suggestive of the patient is probably going to shock. Again, a feature of severe malaria. Again, if the SATs are dropping, with the examination showing bilateral Krebs, so the patient might be going into pulmonary edema. Again, it should be confirmed radiologically. Other features like jaundice, abnormal bleeding, anuria, repeated vomiting. Other lab criteria that we look at is if the HP is less than 7 in an adult, or if it's less than 5 in children. So you know that there is intravascular hemolysis that is happening that can result in hemoglobinuria. That is which is what happens in severe malaria, black water fever. That's what it was called. If you another possible thing is if the patient has recurrent hypoglycemia, if the GRPC goes less than 40, or if the patient has some acidosis with the base deficit more than 8, or plasma bicarbonate less than 15, or if you do an ABG, venous VPG, if you the venous plasma lactate more than 5 millimoles per liter, or if the patient has some worsening renal failure, creatinine more than 3, or if you look at the parasitic index, if it is more than 10%. Some of the guidelines, UK parasitemia guidelines differs based on the different national guidelines actually. So UK parasitemia, they take a cutoff of 2%. Otherwise, everywhere else, more than 10% is considered as a diagnostic criteria for severe malaria. So this is so there are various guidelines that we follow for about management of malaria in pregnancy. So one is WHO guideline. Then we look at Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists guidelines, which is kind of considered as one of the standard guidelines for management of malaria in pregnancy. Third guidelines that we in India that we follow is NVDCP guidelines. So we look at ARCOG 2015 guidelines. So the important things, the gist of what they have recommended is what we'll be discussing here. So based on ARCOG 2015 recommendations, treat every malaria in pregnancy as an emergency. So the ICER that we're looking at, the B, A, C, D, and the tick mark that we're seeing are the grades of recommendation. A being the best, based on the best evidence, and D being with lesser evidence, and tick mark being evidence not evidence based, but based on expert opinion, based on the clinical experience of the national guideline making team. So so the ARCOG 2015 recommendations about malaria pregnancy, like I told you, we have to treat every malaria, whether it is complicated or uncomplicated, have to be treated as an emergency. Which is important here because, like we mentioned before, malaria can present with the non-specific symptoms. So the importance of looking at the blood picture, the blood smear. Otherwise, the diagnosis can be easily missed out. So admit pregnant patients with uncomplicated malaria to hospitals, and pregnant women with severe and complicated malaria to ICU. IV artesunate is the treatment of choice for severe falciparum malaria. If is not available, we can go ahead with the IV quinine. Use quinine and clindamycin to treat uncomplicated Plasmodium falciparum or mixed malaria. Again, in uncomplicated, if the patient is able to tolerate orally, oral formulation can be used. We can use chloroquine to treat Plasmodium vivax, ovale, or malaria. Thymoquine should not be used in pregnancy. If it is again multiple approach better in management of malaria in pregnancy. Do not persist with oral therapy if vomiting is persistent. and treat the fever with antibiotics. Again, the risk of liver failure is always there. Screen women with malaria for anemia and treat appropriately. If you're the patient, if this HP is less than 7, do not hesitate to transfuse the patient. So, so the treatment of malaria is based on whether it is severe or complicated malaria or uncomplicated malaria. So, based on ARCOG 2015 guidelines, IV artesunate is the drug of choice, irrespective of the trimester. However, the current WHO guidelines says second and third, there is no problem in giving artesunate. But the first trimester, based on, as per the current WHO guidelines, quinine is preferred. Quinine is a preferred drug of choice, actually. But then, yeah. So now the problem here is we've had multiple studies showing there is a famous trial, a well-done randomized controlled trial, where we have seen that artesunate, which was to look at whether artesunate versus quinine is best for the treatment of severe falciparum malaria. So the study is a Southeast Asian quinine artesunate malarial trial, which is otherwise called SEQUIMAT group trial. So where we were looking at which is better at treating severe malaria. So based on the study, artesunate is currently the treatment of choice for severe falciparum malaria. If you look at the forest plot of this, left side being favoring artesunate, right side favoring quinine. So based on all the multiple studies, based on this randomized controlled trial, artesunate seemed to be better at with better outcomes in treating severe malaria. So again, the ARCOG guidelines encourages IV artesunate in all the trimesters, irrespective of whether it is first, second, or third. WHO, like we mentioned before, first trimester preferred this quinine, but there are other trials also which has shown that the problem with using artesunate here is we don't have a lot of studies looking at the side effects of artesunate in first trimester, for obvious reasons, because our RCTs cannot be done in first trimester because of the risk of the fetus. But there is a recent meta-analysis that was done that is showing that showed that the difference between that there is not much of a difference in the side effect profile between quinine and artesunate. So WHO has also started endorsing artesunate in first trimester, although the current guidelines favors is still quinine as a drug of choice in first trimester. So that was about the complicated malaria. And our patient, we did treat the patient as complicated malaria because she was dehydrated at presentation with the features of some features of prostration, and we treated her with the IV artesunate. And anyway, she was 12 weeks of gestation, more than 12 weeks of gestation. So uncomplicated malaria, we have an option of giving oral quinine, which is 600 mg Q8 and oral clindamycin. There are, see, not every centers will have clindamycin available. So there has been many centers which has been using quinine as a monotherapy also. Otherwise, oral ACT artemisinin based combination therapy can be used for uncomplicated falciparum malaria. If you look at the non-falciparum malarias, Plasmodium vivax, ovale, and malaria, oral chloroquine is still the best, followed by 300 mg. So 600 mg base will give, followed by 300 mg later, and 300 mg on day 2 and on day 3. Resistant Plasmodium vivax is treated just like uncomplicated falciparum malaria, which is oral quinine versus oral ACT. Preventing relapse during pregnancy, like we mentioned before, primaquine is not used. We use chloroquine, which is orally 300 mg weekly until delivery. So preventing relapse after delivery is usually postponed 3 months after delivery, and G6PD testing. Plasmodium ovale and Plasmodium vivax, oral primaquine at different doses can be given for 14 days, single dose OD for 14 days. If the patient is G6PD positive, primaquine oral for 45 to 60 mg, which is a lesser dose, once a week for 8 weeks is given. This other, we'll be discussing a little bit about the pregnancy-related complications of severe malaria. Again, we need to monitor for hypoglycemia. We have to watch out for pulmonary edema, anemia. If the patient has features of shock, secondary bacterial infection also needs to be thought of. The various complications that can arise in the mother, which are patient can go in coma, they can develop hyperpyrexia, convulsions, hyperglycemia, severe anemia, acute pulmonary edema, renal failure, spontaneous bleeding, metabolic acidosis or shock. Obstetric management, again based on the ARCO guidelines, preterm labor, fetal growth restriction, fetal heart rate abnormalities can occur in malaria in pregnancy. In severe malaria complicated by fetal compromise, a multidisciplinary approach has to be taken. Stillbirth and premature delivery in malaria can be best prevented with prompt and effective anti-malarial treatment. And if the patient has had peripartum malaria, it's an indication for placental histology and to look at the chances of detecting congenital malaria at an early stage. So the learning point from here is we need to have a high index of suspicion to detect malaria in pregnancy, because that's why the importance of looking at the film, the blood film, to detect any acute febrile illness in a pregnancy. Thank you.
Detailed presentation. Has anyone got any doubts? We are running short of time. We'll have the last presentation next medicine 2 next week. This will be closing here. Thanks to everyone who came to meet. We shall meet again next week.